Hello, and welcome to our event today with one of our favorite thriller writers, Charles Cumming. My name's Louisa Smith, and I'm the editor-in-chief of Mysterious Press, buying director for Book Passage Bookstore, and the very lucky host of today's event. I would first like to thank all of you for being here. We know you have a lot of options for how to spend your time on a Saturday, so thank you for choosing to spend your time with us. Book Passage has a robust events program both in-store and online, in no small part due to supporters like you. I hope you will have a chance after today's event to visit our website and see who else is coming. Today, we're celebrating the newly released espionage novel from Charles Cumming, titled Kennedy 35, a Sunday Times and New York Times bestselling author of 12 novels, including A Spy by Nature, Typhoon, The Trinity Six, the Thomas Kell trilogy, and the Box 88 series, which Kirkus describes as the gold standard in espionage fiction. Charles has also been called the best of the new generation of British spy writers who are taking over where Jean Le Carré and Len Deighton left off. He adeptly intertwined spy missions, past and present, for this taut third entry in his Box 88 series, Kennedy 35. And we find Box 88 officer Lachlan Kite having to revisit 1995 when he was on the trail of a Rwandan war criminal in Senegal and reckoning with the fallout from that mission as a more experienced spy today. Kirkus said that steeped in recent history, Cumming's third Box 88 novel depicts the international complexities of modern espionage, as well as the inseparable intertwining of the political and the personal. Like Le Carré and Lawton before him, Cumming is building a modern history through an espionage lens, book by methodical book, an intricate espionage thriller that's both timely and convincing. Now, the best part of these live events is that they allow you, the audience, to ask your own questions of our authors. So if you have a question for Charlie, please enter it in the chat and we will try to get to as many as possible. And with that, I would love to welcome Charlie to the screen here. Hi.
Hi, Louisa. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. And thanks for having me. And thanks for everybody for tuning in on it's a Saturday afternoon. In Europe, I think it's quite late. God knows what time it is in Australia, but I'm very happy to be here.
Well, we're thrilled to have you here. I know you're in town for the Miami Book Festival, which is very exciting. And there's a lot of excitement about your book. And I want to start off by sort of talking about what Kirkus just referenced, how you're building a lens of how to think of recent events and current events, semi-past, not too long ago past events, through the spy lens, through an espionage world lens. Can you speak a little bit about how you approach that?
Sure. I mean, the idea of I'm kind of thinking of the Kite books, the Box 88 books, as a spy saga spanning, basically, by the end of it, it'll be spanning about 40 years, roughly from the collapse of the Berlin Wall in 1989 through 9/11 to the present day. And the idea was I'll write maybe 6, 7, 8 of these books, of which Kennedy 35 is the third. And broadly speaking, you see the young Lachlan Kite in the first novel in Box 88 recruited into this elite Anglo-American spy agency at the age of 18, straight out of boarding school in England. And you follow him through various escapades and operational successes and operational failures through the 1990s. And then the timelines shift to the present day, where Kite is now a man of my age, in his early 50s, and he's running Box 88 in the UK, and reflecting on times past and dealing with present complications and operational pressures. And so the idea is that you, as well as covering the political territory of the 1990s, whether it's the collapse of Soviet communism or the fall of the Berlin Wall, or in the case of 1935, the Rwandan genocide, you're also seeing how espionage in the real world and espionage fiction, I suppose, has changed in the sort of post-Google age of the iPhone and so forth.
I love that. I love that we get a spy when he's young and new and maybe idealistic, maybe, willing to do things or not willing to do things because they're new to him, like all the experiences of a young spy, but you also get to see him as an older spy, now in charge of Box 88 and having weathered a lot of things, maybe more cynical about what's going on in the world. What is it like writing about the same character at two different ages within one book?
It's complicated.
Like that.
I felt that particularly with the book's predecessor, Judas 62, where Kite is sent to Russia in 1992 to extract a Russian chemical weapons scientist from Russia and bring him out to the West. That was a lot of research, a lot of reading, a lot of talking to try and get the city of Voronezh accurate to that period and the immediate sort of post-Soviet period, the lack of food, the lack of law and order, if you like. And I couldn't go to Voronezh because of what the French called the confinement, because of the pandemic. So I was having to do the whole thing from Google Earth and books and conversations. And then the second half of Judas 62 takes place in modern day Dubai, which is, as you know, as far away from post-Soviet Voronezh as you can imagine. But it's like comparing London with the moon. So there was a lot of research that needed to take place in Dubai and conversations and so forth. And that book really felt like two novels in one. So it was frankly a bargain for book buyers. Kennedy is a slimmer volume, but nevertheless is, to answer your question, in dealing with Kite and how he changes, there's still much for me to dwell on. I mean, I was at 24, 25, a vastly different animal to the animal that I am today. You know, we all change hugely in the course of our lives, both sort of in terms of the people that we meet and the relationships we have, and you know, obviously deaths and the births of children and changing financial circumstances and so forth. And Kite has had a more than exciting time as a young man, a much more exciting time than I ever had. And then is sort of finally settled down in his 50s in a first marriage to somebody who he really loves, and they just had a baby at the start of this book, Kennedy 35. So you're dealing with fatherhood for the first time. You're dealing with marriage. You're dealing with Kite is trying to keep a relationship, trying to keep a marriage on the go, while at the same time being a successful, effective intelligence officer. And I mean, the sort of, I suppose the juice of Kennedy 35 and subsequent books will be his relationship with a woman called Martha Rain, who we first meet in Box 88, who is his teenage sweetheart, really his first love. They fall in love in the first book, and she has quite a large role in Judas 62 and another important role in Kennedy 35. And she is both a very active player in the flashback episodes, and then in the present day, she's, without spoiling too much of the plot of Kennedy, she comes back into his life in middle age and stirs things up a bit. So there's tons for me to be contending with, and lots for readers to get their teeth into, I hope.
Was it easier to write one version of Locke versus Lockie? I'm sorry, he's referred to as Lockie in the book, so I've just slipped into that. But,
no, that's right. Yeah.
Is there one version of him that's easier to write than the other, or did you ever find yourself writing like the young one and realizing, like, no, that's old Locke? He wouldn't have, at that age, he wouldn't have thought that way.
I think the main difference is, when I think of Kite, he has a quite similar biography to me, but he is in every way, certainly as a young man, smarter. He matures a lot quicker than I did. If you like, he sort of knows himself and he understands the world. Even in his late teens, early 20s, he's an old soul in the way that I was not an old soul. So I have to check myself and make sure that it's Kite reacting to things in the way that Kite would react, rather than young Charles Cumming in 1995. And the same really goes for the present day, that he's much tougher than me, not to mention more experienced in this world. You know, I've been staring at a computer screen like this for the last 30 years, you know, making stories up, and I haven't been extracting chemical weapon scientists from Russia or in Kennedy, trying to make sure that nobody finds out what went wrong in Africa 30 years ago. I mean, the most stressful thing that happens to me is one of my children have to change their nappy, you know. So it's it's an effort, but it is for, I guess, for all writers to make sure that our characters are credible and interesting, and that their relationships ring true. Because I think that's what people come back to in these novels. Where it's not really what happens; it's who it happens to. It's they come back for Kite, they come back for Martha, in the same way that they come back for Jackson Lamb or George Smiley.
I love that you just spoke about relationships, because there's so much about relationships in all of your novels, but especially in this one, about the relationships that draw him back. It's really the relationships that are drawing him back into thinking about what happened all those years ago in Senegal and having to deal with it. And those relationships that have changed over time. Martha, who you mentioned, plays a really important role. Did you know when you started with Box 88 that Martha was going to be back and that this was a relationship you were going to be carrying forward through all these books?
Yeah, I mean, I'll tell you how the books came about. Which is a way of answering the question. I had written, and some of the people watching this may have read, some of my earlier books, like the Kell series or the Trinity Six or Typhoon. And those books had been well received and had done well, but I had hit a point of frustration with what I call the mobile phone problem, which is that in storytelling, especially in telling contemporary thrillers, you're always at the mercy of technology. To put it briefly, a person can call for help. They can be found. There's a huge amount of information about them on a phone. If they're lost, they can look at their phone and there's a map on it, and so forth. And so in telling a contemporary story, you're always having to think about, can this person be seen on CCTV? If they get in a car, will there be number plate recognition cameras that will track that car? If they go through an airport, the retinal scans will have their eyes, and therefore, et cetera, et cetera. And I said to I am going to answer your question, I said to my editor, I really wanted to write some stories that are set in the 1990s, which is the sort of the decade that the spy novel forgot. Because really, at the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union, a lot of intelligence services felt that they were out of business because they had nothing left to do. Sort of Francis Fukuyama's end of history, as it were. And really, the only novelist who was functioning effectively in the 90s was John le Carré, who had made his name in the 60s, in the 70s, so 20 years earlier. And my editor in the UK, she said to me, well, I like that idea. I like the idea of doing 90s set spy novels, the sort of the nostalgia of it and going back into that pre-Google world, because that was the interest for me, that it would be old-fashioned sort of Moscow rules, chalk marks on walls and so forth. But she said, you've built up this reputation as a 21st century spy novelist. I think it'd be a shame to give that up. And that's where the idea came for the two timelines, and to do both, to do the historical 1990s Kite and the 21st century Kite. And then it was really just a question of building that world. I'm finally coming to your question, Louisa, who is this man, and who are his friends? Who is his mother? Who is his father? Where does he go to school? Where does he go to university? What are the circumstances which have led him to be this remarkable young person who is going to do these remarkable things, who's going to be entrusted, more importantly, by this elite organization to represent them and to do things for them. And then Martha was just, I mean, in the first book, in Box 88, Kite is tasked with, he's recruited straight out of school and tasked with spying on his best friend. His best friend's family are a wealthy family. They have a beautiful villa in the south of France. It's 1989. And they have an Iranian friend, a family friend, coming to stay for a week in this beautiful villa. And Box 88 believe that he's the bag man for the financier for the Lockerbie bombing the year before. And they're worried that he is part of a network and that they're planning an atrocity in New York. And so they want Kite to be in the house with him, to be befriending him, to go through his litter bins, to go through, what do you call it, his trash in America, to go through his trash. And Martha arrives as a friend of his best friend's sister, and she's beautiful and funny and clever, and Kite just falls for her hook, line, and sinker. But then the tension in their relationship throughout subsequent books, which is what I wanted to sort of explore, is how much does Martha know about what Kite is up to? She just thinks he's a 18-year-old kid who's kind of quite good looking and listens to bad music, who makes her laugh and is sort of interesting from a slightly different background. She has absolutely no idea that he's a spook, what we call in the UK a spook, a spy. And so yeah, you follow the ups and downs of this relationship through the decade, and it's fairly tumultuous. It makes Ross and Rachel look like a birthday party.
I love that that we now refer to the 90s as historical fiction. It doesn't feel like it should be, but yeah, it was such a different time, pre-phone, such a different time.
Yeah,
And
well, that's a feature of Kennedy, is that
yeah,
you have Kite and Martha, so they're together at the beginning of the book, and they're both, what would they be, 24 in 1995, and Kite hasn't been doing very much. He's done some training in Manhattan for Box 88 for about 6 months, and Martha's come over to New York to visit him, and then Michael Strawson, who's the ex-CIA boss of Box 88, one of the men who recruited Kite in the first place, sends him off to Senegal, which is, as you know, is on the sort of point of West Africa, the most westernmost point of the continent of Africa. And they're really tasked with just waiting, and they're there pretending to be backpackers, just a young couple traveling around West Africa. But their real mission is to go into Dakar, the capital of Senegal, and to join a Box 88 team in grabbing a Rwandan war criminal who was responsible for perpetrating, one of the people responsible for perpetrating the genocide the year before. And the technology of that is very interesting, because he doesn't have, as you say, there were no cell phones. You couldn't just run to a street corner and put a couple of dimes in a call box and ring up and go, we've got a problem. And the ability in 1995 to communicate with anybody in Dakar was really, really limited. Only a few private houses had landlines. A few, obviously, hotels had telephones, but a lot of the city is just out of communication, as it were. And that it's incredibly exciting to write about that environment and to set Kite a whole load of problems, because the one thing he needs to do is in this story as it plays out is to warn his boss, to warn the team that something has gone very, very badly wrong, but he can't. So he's the only person who can save the day. And he has a pager, which, you know, we always used to have a pager in the 90s. Call your mum. You know, you had to sort of find a phone box, and I never called my mum. But his pager doesn't work, you know, or the radios, because it's so incredibly hot and so amazingly humid in Senegal in October. The radio that he's got, you know, in his ear fails to work because of the humidity. It just gets into the nuts and bolts of the radio and it fails to work. So you have all this fun with the technology, and it makes it much, much more about the characters rather than about the phone or about the laptop. And I think that's just very interesting to write about, but secondly for readers to read about.
It makes for a richer book when somebody can't just answer a question by picking up a phone, but they have to search for it. And you mentioned Senegal. I loved the setting in Senegal. I just completely was swept away by how you conveyed it. I can still picture the streets, you know, the motorcycle races down the streets, or when they were at the resort, you know, sitting out there. How did you do the research for it? Did you choose the setting and then set the story around it, or did you have the story and try to find the setting for it? I mean, how does that process work for you? Because all of your books actually have really interesting locales in them.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was hearing the other day that Alfred Hitchcock, when he was doing North by Northwest, he just had 3 ideas. He had the plane, you know, the plane attack at the crop field. He wanted to do a scene where Cary Grant gets chased by a plane. He wanted to do a scene on Mount Rushmore, and then a third one, shooting at the UN. Right? Those are the 3 ideas that he wanted to put in the film. And he just said to his genius screenwriters, write me a spy thriller with those 3 sequences in it. And so they came up with North by Northwest. Yeah, you wouldn't often think that stories are, you think that it's sort of, you know, in the beginning there was, it doesn't work like that. And with Kennedy, literally all I had in my head was an image of Kite and Martha on a beach in Africa, staring out to sea on a sort of, in a kind of a paradise seaside resort. And that was always Kenya in my head, because of, I suppose, some sort of colonial link to Kenya, and I'd been out in that part of the world, and so it has a kind of Anglophone texture, which might have been quite interesting. And I was all set to go. I had all these interesting journalists and diplomats and NGO people in Nairobi and elsewhere who were going to help me out to sort of, you know, in the early phases of my search. and it was the pandemic again. I suddenly at the last minute thought I better just look at the Foreign Office advice for Kenya, and sure enough, it was red zoned. And when I came home, I was going to have to sit in a hospital at Gatwick, a hotel at Gatwick Airport for 10 days. What do you call it? What was that thing we had to do when when you have the disease and you got to make sure you don't have it? And
Oh yeah.
So I couldn't go. It was too much time to waste. So then I looked, and Senegal was one of the few places in Africa where British passport holders could go without doing this word that I've forgotten. And it was actually a really nice slice of luck. And I found very interesting people in Dakar, and it was just a sort of perfect setting. It's not Anglophone. It's a former French colony, which gives it a slightly sort of different texture. So it has a very modern sort of mid 20th century vibe downtown in the area called Plateau, where a lot of the action takes place. And then the rest of the city is what you characterize as just very African. It's not metalled streets. It's not street lighting. It's not sort of cappuccinos and sea bass in fancy restaurants. It's working class Africa, and so it's just a fantastic place to set a story of this kind.
Well, there was I loved how you captured not just the place but the people there. I run a Mystery Abroad book group for Book Passage, and we just had a really great conversation about another book that takes place in Africa called Wives of the God. And it's and we were talking about how difficult it is. We read a lot of authors that are from those areas, but how hard it would be if you weren't from there to figure out how to convey the a realistic character from that area. And one of my favorite characters from your book that's from there is Grace. And I know there's an interesting story behind how you were able to capture Grace. I'm hoping that you'll share that with everybody.
Yeah. I was very lucky again. So in the story, the Box 88 team is going after this genocidaire in Dakar, and he has a girlfriend who he is traveling in tandem with, and they're both trying to get a passport to get out of Dakar and fly to the United States. And this woman is from Congo. She's very beautiful. She's highly intelligent, far more intelligent actually than the man that she's with. And she just wasn't really landing on the page in the way that I wanted her to. She wasn't really coming to life. And earlier this year, in late January, my wife and I we were very lucky. We went to a beautiful hotel in Mauritius with our young son, just for 8-9 days of relaxation. And at this hotel, there was an extremely glamorous, very sort of beautiful Grace Mavinga-like woman turned out South Africa, who was sort of floating around the hotel with her 2 children and her husband. And was a library in this hotel where I was working on early chapters of Kennedy and doing some editing and so forth. And her daughter used to come into the library and sort of say, "What are you doing?" And I'd tell her I was a storyteller. And then her mum walked in and we got talking. And just in the business of kind of having a kind of everyday conversation with her and just sort of looking at her and the clothes that she wore and so forth, I suddenly thought I have a much better grasp of who Grace is in the present day, because she then becomes not that this woman was like that, but she then becomes a kind of money laundering crook, really, giving cover to all sorts of bad people in the present day, covering up their ill-gotten gains and laundering it through companies and so forth. And I got this woman's number, and we had a couple of very long telephone conversations, and she told me quite a lot about her childhood in South Africa and how she'd run away from a township and gone down to Cape Town, and had then been discovered by this kind of quite older man who had proposed marriage, and then she'd moved to Central Europe and to start a family. So she just was a really good way for me to understand how somebody from a world that I have no experience of and would come to be very wealthy and very well connected. And when she gets onto an airplane, she turns left, not right. She buys her shoes from Jimmy Choo and all the rest of it. So that was very, very helpful in putting Grace Mavinga together.
How does it usually work for you in trying to capture these people from very different backgrounds?
Well, some of it is common sense or experience, or I mean, it's quite rare that I meet somebody who I immediately then try to put into a book. I certainly didn't do that with this woman who helped with Grace for obvious reasons. It's I don't know how to answer that really, except in the sense of, one just has so many interactions in one's life, and so many encounters with people from America, from France, from Italy, from Spain, from London, that they'll either work their way subconsciously into a story, or if I'm consciously looking for somebody or if somebody comes into my orbit, and I think, oh my God, I must use that, something they said or some aspect of their character. A good example was an American guy I met in Shanghai when I was researching a novel I wrote called Typhoon. This is about 15 years ago. And he'd been introduced to me by a friend out there who was introducing me to all sorts of people in the expat community. And he was a big kind of alpha male American executive who came for dinner at a beautiful restaurant called Jean Georges, overlooking the Bund in Shanghai. And he was loud, and he was funny, and he was clever, but he was there was something kind of quite appalling about him as well. And we had I think you call it an entree here, we call it a starter in the UK, the first course in the meal. And we finished that, and he suddenly just got up and left, leaving me with my friend, just the two of us. And I said, "Where's he gone?" He said, "I have no idea." So my friend and I, we then had the main course, is it appetizer? I didn't.
You just reversed the two.
I just reversed it, right. Yeah. Appetizer and then entree. That's it. And he then came back about half an hour later after we'd finished our chicken or our fish or whatever it was. And I said, or my friend said, where did you go? He said, "Oh, I went to see my mistress." He had a girlfriend, a Chinese girlfriend who lived 20 minutes away. She'd sent him a message on the phone saying, "Come to me, come to me." So he'd got up and left dinner, and then had come back. So I thought, this guy, he's got to go straight in the book. So he became the model for actually the CIA officer in Typhoon. So these people do wander into your life, and when they do, you need to grab them. Oh, by the way, the word I was trying to think of earlier, quarantine.
Quarantine. Oh my gosh. We're blocking it because we're so traumatized. Just to shift gears slightly on this, from people that you don't know to people that you do. I remember watching an interview that you did with Mick Herron a few years ago about, you went to a school, when you were quite young, you were sent to an all-boys school that was similar to Eton. Is that correct? But not exactly.
So Kite, aged 13, is sent to a boarding school, which is very similar to Eton. I was actually at the age of 12. I was sent away at 8. Crazily enough, that's what we do to our kids in the UK. There's actually a very good school called Ludgrove, where Princes William and Harry also both went after me, obviously. And I mean, they say that a writer's childhood is his or her bank balance. And I'd never really written about Eton. And Eton is the most famous school in the world. I think, Harvard, but there's also it's a university, and Oxford and Cambridge. I mean, really, as a sort of high school, there's nothing really that compares to Eton. It's this sort of mythic place where the boys walk around in tailcoats, and George Orwell went there, David Cameron, and all, Gladstone, so forth. And I thought, I must tell people about this school. I must write about it, because there's so much sort of myth making around it, so much nonsense and so much truth. And there's a lot of prejudice in my country against Old Etonians for good reasons and bad reasons. And I also thought it'd be very interesting for Kite, who's from a slightly different walk of life, a kind of working class kid, really, from Scotland, to be thrown into this very privileged elite ecosystem, and to see how if he flourishes, if he sinks or swims. And so, yeah, there's a section, just not a very long section, but a section in Box 88 which really describes my experience of going to Eton as a 13, 14-year-old. And by the way, Kite does a lot better there than I ever did. He's academically successful. He plays in the first 11 cricket team.
He's having the childhood you wanted to have.
He's successful with women. It's this whole thing is just wish fulfillment for me, Louise.
Well, one thing I loved, but when Mick were talking about it, was how you said that it sort of sets people up to be perfect spies. They have to learn how to get along with people, make friends. You were just talking about how you you met these characters. I mean, you befriended this woman in a way that, as a spy might, with a source. When you go to a school like that, such an early age, you have to learn how to get along, how to maybe hide who you truly are. And it's kind of the perfect, and you're meeting all these people from various walks of life. It's a great setting for a spy to come out of.
Yeah, I mean, I think those schools, Eton and other boarding schools like it, they do create a certain type of person, not always, but often, who is sort of socially isolated, and forced really to function, to find a way of functioning in the world earlier than they ordinarily would if their mother and father were around every night. And also you learn to, I don't think I necessarily did this, but to a certain extent I did, to sort of put on a mask and to be a certain way in order to get on with people, in order to function in this environment. And historically, yeah, MI6 has always loved old Etonians, and as you say, because they're good at relationships. They're good at, you can sort of put them in a room and they can talk to the housekeeper, the cleaner, the janitor, the taxi driver, and they can also talk to the ambassador and the president. They have an easefulness, not always, but it's a sort of generalization. But there's a certain type of Etonian who is comfortable doing that. As I'm saying this to you, I'm thinking about I'm in Miami at the moment, and I was talking to my English friend who I'm staying with last night, about Americans in general are much friendlier in the first instance than Brits are. If you meet somebody here, they look you in the eye, they shake your hand. Americans are just friendly. They want to know who you are. They so where are you from, and all the rest of it. Whereas Brits are, generally speaking, quite reserved and not very friendly. It takes a long time to get us going. And so actually what I'm trying to say is that these characteristics that I'm describing of an Etonian or a sort of public school boy are not that unusual here, but they are quite unusual in my country.
Oh, interesting.
And I think you're dead right about the idea of meeting people and sort of using them for fiction. I suppose I was sort of, in a very brief way, recruiting this woman who helped with Grace. I mean, I was completely frank with her. I said, listen, I've got this character, and she's a murderer, and she's a money launderer, and she's venal, and she has no children, and all she cares about is money. I mean, so I did give her fair warning. I didn't give the American guy in Shanghai fair warning. But yes, it is an active recruitment, I guess. But then writers are very hard on themselves too. There's tons of me in all my books, really. And I always try to spare my closest relatives and closest friends from appearing in my books. I've never written about my father, for example, in my fiction. I don't write about my wife, and it's or put those close people into my books, which is not always the case with novelists, as I'm sure you know.
I remember my dad killed off my dogs in one book.
Right.
Speaking of your other books and putting yourself into it, now you were also approached to be part of not MI6,
yeah.
MI6 when you were in college. That's true, right? And
yeah,
go ahead.
No, well, that's also one of the sort of autobiographical elements of the Kite series, that Lockie is, as I've said, is recruited straight out of Eton at the age of 18 in his sort of final summer, what they call summer semester. It was later for me, and it was MI6. I was 25. I went home for the weekend to stay with my mother and my late stepfather, and a school for an old Etonian school friend of my stepfather, who had been there in the 50s, came for dinner because he just moved into the community. He just retired, he said, from the Foreign Office. And during the dinner, Yitzhak Rabin, it was the night that Rabin was assassinated in Israel. So we all sort of got up from dinner, and we were watching the news of this awful tragedy. And I must have said one or two coherent political things. And a few days later, my mum ran into this man in her local supermarket. And he said, has Charles ever thought about the diplomatic service? And my mother said, no, but he has now, because I wasn't doing very much of my life. And so he put me forward for these interviews, which I thought was just going to be straight diplomatic service, because I always sort of thought of myself as a genial diplomatic sort of chap. And in fact, that he'd obviously seen some fissure in my personality or darkness there. He thought, no, he'll be a good spy. So I went along and was interviewed for, I suppose the whole process took maybe 3-4 months. And I didn't get in, but it was a really fascinating exposure to this world about which I knew very little. And I then read a sort of yard of John le Carré and various nonfiction books about espionage, and then wrote my first novel, A Spy by Nature. And so I have always been fascinated by what would have happened to me had I gone into that world. And so in A Spy by Nature, you see what happens to Alec Milius and how his life is turned inside out by going into, in that case, MI5. And with Kite, yeah, he gets the tap on the shoulder when he's really young. And yeah, just the pressure on an individual to pretend to be somebody that they are not throughout the course of their life, on being able to tell either close friends, close members of their family, what they do, what they have done, even husbands or wives. You're a intelligence officer working for MI6 in Paris, and you say to your wife at 11 o'clock at night, I've got to go out, I don't know when I'll be back. That's a lot of pressure on a marriage. And all of that stuff is of great interest to me, the personal as well as the political, as we were talking about before. And I just always wondered what, in some subconscious way, the man that I would have been and would have become if I had gone into the secret world, as opposed to sitting in front of computers for 30 years making it up.
It's interesting. Just hearing you say that makes me feel like, I think people often feels like they're wearing masks or they're hiding who their true self is, even if they're not a spy. And this is sort of pushing it to the extremes that you would be. And maybe that's one of the reasons that people really are drawn to spy fiction, because they do wonder what it's like when that mask is pushed to that level.
Yeah, I think there's this generalized human fascination with deception and with appearances. And as you absolutely, we're all lying to one another in small ways all the time, whether it's putting on a face to somebody that you despise, or saying to your son, oh, I can't play soccer with you now because I've got to work. And in fact, you just can't be bothered to play soccer with your son, whatever it might be. But also at a deeper level, the sort of fascination with vanishing into another personality. Just being somebody else. What would that be like to have somebody else's passport, to have somebody a completely different identity? Instead of being Louisa Smith, bookseller and editor, you'd suddenly be Louisa Smith, pharmaceutical engineer or something. And that, you wouldn't be Louisa Smith. You'd be Mary Jones, pharmaceutical engineer, and to take on that persona. By the way, that's one of the other things that's very interesting about spying in the last 30 years, is that you actually couldn't become Mary Jones, pharmaceutical engineer, because there's just too much information about Louisa Smith out there. Your eyes, your face, your
and there wouldn't be the history, the social media history, and all that stuff.
Yeah, so that's an element in Judas 62. When Kite goes to contemporary Dubai, he has to go into Dubai, even though he's there operationally. He has to enter on his own passport. He has to go in as Lachlan Kite, use his own credit cards, book into the hotel as Lachlan Kite, because he's been there before. And if he goes in under a false identity using what they call a legend, as soon as he goes through the airport, they've got his eyes, they've got even his gait, G-A-I-T, his walk, and he'll be arrested before he even gets to the baggage area. So all that stuff has changed, and putting people into new environments become even more complicated.
You mentioned Dubai, and I meant to ask earlier, when you are doing these books, they all are centered around an event that happens in our sort of recent past, a sort of pivotal event, a tragedy usually that has happened, or I guess with the collapse of Russia, just a giant event that has happened politically in the world. Do you already in your head, because you said you have about 6 or 8 of these novels, do you have those events like mapped out, which ones you're going to be sort of working the novel around? This one is the genocide in Rwanda.
Yeah, I
even
would
though
love
it's
to. I mean,
different people's. Sorry, go ahead.
we should come clear that you're my American editor. So
I am.
I'm now going to lie. I mean, I'm going to lie to you. No, I'm not going to lie to you. I'm going to tell you the truth. I have the final book of the Kite saga sort of pretty much worked out. There's a sort of wonderful twist at the end, and which I think readers will love. But that's several years and several books off. I didn't have a kind of what's Harry Potter world called, or Tolkien world, Mordor, and all. I don't have that sort of world building map on my office wall where I know exactly which points and beats I'm going to hit, and in which book, and what's going to happen, and who's going to die. I like to leave myself a little bit of wiggle room and space to make changes and to come up with better ideas. But in the fourth Kite book, which I don't yet have a title for, so if anybody's listening and watching and has an idea for a good title, please let me know. Basically, Martha, who I was mentioning before, Kite's girlfriend from the 1990s, who then gets married to an American actually and moves to New York with him in the early 2000s and has two kids, a son and a daughter. And the son in the present day is now 20, and he has vanished. He's just dropped off the grid. None of his friends haven't heard of him. His employer, he's dropped off social media. It's this complete mystery. He's vanished. And Martha comes to Kite because she's moved back to London because she's now divorced from the American. And she says, using your skills and your assets, resources, can you find my son? And so Kite agrees. And that takes them, in fact, to Athens, where this boy was sort of last seen. And the story is really a sort of chase, a hunt for this boy and the person that he's with before a third party get to them first. So I have that. You'll be pleased to know I have the fourth book quite well worked out, and they go up from Athens into the Balkans and Albania and up to Sarajevo. But beyond that, it's interesting. When I first proposed the series to HarperCollins, my publishers in the UK, part of the proposal was a novel set in America around the Oklahoma bombing, as to reference a sort of real political event, and also around kind of the Koch brothers, sort of right-wing political financing and influence and so forth. I really wanted to write about that. But I wonder, this is a conversation for another day perhaps, but whether there are already enough American writers dealing with stories like that, and it's not my place to come here and start sounding off on Trump or the Koch brothers or whatever, and that American writers should deal with those subjects, and I should stick to Europe and West Africa.
Well, I mean, I think it's interesting that your UK publishers felt like that was important. I wonder if it's because America is such a big audience for your books, and they feel like we'd be more interested. I don't know how they got the thought that we are mostly interested in ourselves. We haven't done anything to make them think that. But you're right. There are a lot of books on that, and I think part of what makes your books so much fun to be in is being in these other parts of the world. Now, I am looking forward to when you turn your eye on us. I think that'll be fun, but I don't know that you need to. Only if it works. That, again, a discussion for another day with Charlie. But well, you know, your first books you've written a lot of spy novels at this point, and a lot of them were with MI5 and spy organizations that exist in the real world. Box 88 is something that you came up with. Can you explain a little bit what Box 88 is and how maybe writing fictional group of spies, what sort of freedoms that gives you, and how much or how more difficult it is to do that? I mean, I'm not sure. I'm assuming that it gives you freedoms, but maybe it makes it difficult because you have to come up with everything.
No, freedom actually is a very useful word to use in that context, because whether my books have always striven to be sort of quasi-realistic. Like, I don't want stuff going on that is just sort of ludicrous, spies going off into space or something like that. You know, I'd like it to keep it grounded and real, particularly because they're rooted often in real political events. But if you're really true to the business of spying, and certainly in its British context at MI5, which is our version of the FBI, and MI6, which is CIA, there is a lot of box ticking. There's a lot of bureaucracy. If an intelligence officer wants to mount a particular operation, there's about 19 people that need to sign off on it. And you see this a lot in the sort of late Le Carre, actually all Le Carre novels. They're sort of almost novels of The Office. Same with McCarran's Slough House novels, and people, love that stuff, and they love the petty feuds and the ambitious people working their way up, and the rivalries and the tension of office life, really ministerial brinkmanship, and that doesn't interest me. And I want to get out of London and go to Dakar. I want to go to Warsaw. I want to go to Berlin, Vienna, or New York, partly because it's tax deductible for me when I'm doing the research trips. But no, as a writer, I've always had that kind of Graham Greene thing of let's show the world to readers. And I've now forgotten your question. But Box 88, yes, Box 88 is an Anglo-American organization which has very little oversight. So if Kite wants to do a thing, he doesn't have to make a phone call to 9 different people saying, do we have the budget? Do we have the time? Do we have the manpower? He just has the freedom to go and put out the fires that need to be put out. And if that means killing somebody or behaving in a way that might draw the attention of sort of conservative newspapers or whatever, then so be it. So that gives me freedom to tell the most interesting story without worrying that, the Home Secretary didn't sign off on it, if you like. And it also gives it another added veil of secrecy. Does everybody in MI6 know about Box 88? Absolutely not. Do many people in the American intelligence apparatus know about Box 88? Absolutely not. By the way, it's not as far as I know, it's not an organization like that doesn't exist. Although I did have a conversation with a retired MI6 officer when I was planning Box 88, and I said, "What do you think?" And he said, "I was sure that there was something like that when I was working at MI6." So I thought, well, if he was sure, then I'm onto something. But it just, as you say, it's freedom. It loosens me up, and I don't have to do all of the politicking in the background. They can just get on the airplane and go and do exciting things.
I love that about it. Now you have written all these different series. I'm hoping that this is the most fun one that you've done, but do you ever think about going back and bringing back one of those other characters? Will we see any of those other books again?
Well, it's funny. I was talking about Alec Milius, who was my first protagonist, who was the hero of A Spy by Nature and The Spanish Game. And A Spy by Nature did quite well in the UK. And then it was published here quite a long time afterwards, about 5, 6, 7 years afterwards. And a lot of American readers responded very negatively to Alec because he's sort of loathsome, very self-involved, very ambitious, a kind of liar. There's a sort of healthy dose of self-pity in him. But I think he's also kind of like a Ripley figure. You find him fascinating. He's compelling, hopefully. And then he's sort of almost more of those things in the sequel, in The Spanish Game. I'm really selling these books. But I always planned those books as a trilogy. And I feel as though I'd love to, if I'm given enough time, to go back and revisit Alec as a 55, 60-year-old man and just seal off the trilogy and sort of give him what you might call kind of redemption. Like he's just become a better man. And he's realized the mistakes of his youth, and he has put away childish things, if you like. But he's the only character that I would happily revisit. I feel with the Kel trilogy, which is a Foreign Country, Cold War, and Divided Spy, that was done. I don't want to go back there. I mind the sort of psychological material of that character and the people around him, and that's completed. But no, Milius I would go back to. But I'm really enjoying these Kite books. I think they're going to be 6 or 7 of them, which is going to take me up to the age of 60. Next time we do this, I'll be completely bald, and then we'll see. Maybe a Milius book. And there's been a film in the works of A Spy by Nature for 20 years. They had Donald Gleason lined up to play Milius before he became Donald Gleason. He went off to do Star Wars. And just the other day, we had Paul Mescal, who was going to play Milius, who would have been incredible. And then Ridley Scott came along with about 5 times as much money and said, "Do you want to be in Gladiator 2?" So he's gone off and done that. So we lost him. But I think particularly if there was ever a film made of A Spy by Nature, that would also give a commercial appetite for a third book. So if that happens, then never say never.
Well, I've been a big fan for this for years. Was it Spy by Nature when we first met? Was that the one?
I think we met in San Francisco, and I was over for Trinity 6. I think.
Trinity 6. Was it for Trinity 6? Years
Yeah.
ago.
Yeah, a long time ago. Yeah.
Very long time ago. And boy, I couldn't be more proud of this book and of what you have accomplished. And our readers are just loving it. And huge congratulations, Charles.
Thank you, Lucy. Thank you.
Here. I really appreciate it. And to everybody out there, thank you so much for being here today. We appreciate it here at Book Passage and with Mysterious Press. I hope that you will pick up Kennedy 35 and enjoy it as much as I did. Thank you again.
Thank you, Lucy.
Thank you.